Have you ever wondered what drives an ordinary person to risk everything for a complete stranger? What compels someone to throw away their safety, their reputation, and even their life for another human being they barely know? Tonight, I want to tell you a story that will challenge everything you think you know about courage, compassion, and the choices we make when darkness falls across the world. Picture this. It is December 1943. Snow blankets the English countryside like a funeral shroud. The war has been raging for 4 long years now. Rationing has stripped the color from the daily life. Every family has lost someone. Every village carries the weight of empty chairs at dinner tables. And in the grand halls of Ashworth Manor, something extraordinary is about to unfold. This is not just another wartime tale. This is the story of Margaret Whitmore, a 24-year-old housemaid whose quiet existence is about to collide with forces that will test the very limits of human decency. What you're about to hear happened behind closed doors, in whispered conversations, and in moments stolen from the watchful eyes of a world at war. But before we dive into Margaret's story, let me paint you a picture of what life was really like for someone in her position during those dark winter months of 1943. You see, being a maid in a grand English manor during wartime was not the romantic notion that period dramas might have you believe. It was backbreaking work that began before dawn and ended well after dusk. Margaret would rise at 4:30 each morning to light the fires in every room before the family awakened. Her hands were permanently stained from coal dust and cleaning solutions. Her back ached from scrubbing floors on her knees and hauling buckets of water up 3 flights of stairs. The manor itself had seen better days. Lord Ashworth had been called to service with the Royal Navy, leaving his wife, Lady Catherine, to manage the estate with a skeleton crew of servants. Most of the able-bodied men had gone to war, leaving behind the old, the infirm, and the young women like Margaret to keep the vast house functioning. The east wing had been closed off entirely to save on heating costs. Dust sheets covered furniture in rooms that had once hosted elaborate dinner parties and Christmas celebrations. Food was scarce, even for the wealthy. Lady Catherine's dinner table, which had once groaned under the weight of roasts and puddings, now featured meager portions of root vegetables and the occasional rabbit that the groundskeeper managed to snare. Margaret and the other servants survived on even less: a thin porridge for breakfast, bread and margarine for lunch, and whatever scraps remained from the family's evening meal. Yet despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, there was a strange sense of purpose that permeated the manor. Everyone had a role to play in keeping civilization intact, while the world tore itself apart beyond their gates. Margaret took pride in maintaining the standards that had been set long before the war began. She polished silver that might never again grace a proper dinner party. She swept and dusted rooms that might remain empty for years. She did this not because she had to, but because someone needed to remember what life had been like before the bombs started falling. The village of Little Ashford lay 3 miles down a winding lane from the manor. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets were currency and gossip traveled faster than the morning milk delivery. The local constable, Harold Pemberton, made his rounds twice daily, checking on the elderly and making sure blackout curtains were properly drawn. The vicar, Reverend Thompson, held services every Sunday to pray for the boys overseas and comfort the families left behind. But even in this close-knit community, there were whispers of things that did not belong. Strange lights seen in the woods at night, unfamiliar footprints in the snow near the old hunting lodge, missing food from pantries and root cellars. The authorities blamed it on deserters from the local army base, men who had lost their nerve and fled into the countryside rather than face another deployment. There had been searches, of course, but the woods around Little Ashford were vast and full of hiding places known only to poachers and children who had played there for generations. Margaret had heard these whispers during her weekly trips to the village for supplies. She had seen the way Mrs. Henderson at the post office lowered her voice when speaking of the missing preserves from her cellar. She had noticed how young Tommy Fletcher claimed to have seen a figure moving through the trees behind his father's farm, only to be told by the adults that he had an overactive imagination. What Margaret could not have known, as she went about her daily routine of cleaning and cooking and mending, was that her world was about to intersect with one of these mysterious figures in a way that would change everything. She could not have imagined that her simple act of leaving a window unlatched in the servants' quarters would become an invitation that someone desperate enough would eventually accept. The night it happened was like any other winter evening at the manor. Lady Catherine had retired early with a headache brought on by another letter from the War Office about her husband's extended deployment. The cook, Mrs. Morrison, had finished preparing a modest supper and gone to her quarters in the village. The other maid, young Sarah Collins, had already departed for her half-day off to visit her ailing mother. Margaret found herself alone in the great house, as she often did on such evenings. She moved through her closing routine with practiced efficiency, banking the fires in the main rooms, checking the locks on the doors, drawing the heavy blackout curtains across every window. The silence was profound in a way that only large, empty houses can achieve. Her footsteps echoed in the hallways despite her attempts to move quietly. It was as she was completing her final check of the ground floor that she heard it. A sound so faint, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. A soft scratching at the kitchen door, like a branch blown against the wood by the wind. But there was no wind that night. The air hung still and cold, heavy with the promise of more snow. Margaret stood frozen in the hallway, her hand gripping the banister as she strained to listen. There it was again. Not scratching now, but a gentle tapping. 3 soft knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Someone was at the door, someone who did not want to wake the entire household. Her first instinct was to flee upstairs and lock herself in her room until morning. After all, who would be calling at such an hour? And why would they not use the front entrance like any proper visitor? But something about the tentative nature of those knocks gave her pause. There was desperation in that sound, but also a strange politeness, as if the person outside was asking permission, rather than demanding entry. Margaret moved toward the kitchen on feet that seemed to have developed a will of their own. Each step brought her closer to a decision that would ripple through the rest of her life in ways she could not begin to fathom. The tapping came again, more urgent now, but still restrained, still hopeful rather than threatening. She reached the heavy wooden door and pressed her ear against it, listening for any clue about who might be standing in the cold darkness beyond. What she heard made her heart skip a beat. It was breathing, labored and shallow, the kind of breathing that comes from exhaustion and fear and cold that has settled deep into the bones. Margaret's hand moved to the iron bolt that secured the door, then stopped. Everything she'd been taught about safety, about propriety, about the dangers that lurked in wartime Britain screamed at her to walk away. But something deeper, something that spoke to the part of her that had always felt sympathy for injured animals and lost children, urged her forward. She slid the bolt back with trembling fingers, the metal scraping against metal in the silence. The sound seemed impossibly loud in her ears. Slowly, carefully, she opened the door just wide enough to peer into the darkness beyond. What she saw there would haunt her dreams and shape her destiny in ways she never could have imagined. Standing in the doorway was a figure that defied every expectation Margaret might have harbored about midnight visitors. The man before her was young, perhaps no more than 25, with hollow cheeks and eyes that held the kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. His uniform, though torn and muddied, was unmistakably German. The Feldgrau wool hung loose on his gaunt frame, and his boots were split at the seams from hard walking across rough terrain. But it was not the uniform that made Margaret gasp and step backward. It was the way he stood there, swaying slightly from weakness, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that seemed to have become second nature. There was no arrogance in his bearing, no trace of the conquering soldier that propaganda posters had taught her to fear. Instead, she saw something that cut through every barrier of nationality and politics. She saw desperation wearing a human face. The young man's lips moved, forming words in accented English that came out as barely more than a whisper. "Please." The word hung in the cold air between them like a prayer offered to an uncertain God. He repeated it, this time with more urgency, though his voice remained soft. "Please, I mean no harm." Margaret felt her world tilt on its axis. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door, to run upstairs and telephone the constable, to do her duty as a loyal British citizen. But something in those hollow eyes held her transfixed. This was not the face of an enemy. This was the face of someone who had lost everything and found himself standing at the edge of the world, asking for the simple mercy of another human being. Behind him, she could see the evidence of his journey written in the snow. Footprints leading from the woods, unsteady and wandering, told the story of someone who had been walking for hours, perhaps days, without proper rest or food. The tracks were filled with fresh snow, suggesting he had been standing at her door for some time, gathering the courage to knock. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. Margaret's hand remained on the door handle, ready to close it at the first sign of threat. But the threat never came. Instead, the young man slowly reached into his coat pocket, moving with deliberate care to show he meant no harm. What he withdrew made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. It was a photograph, creased and worn from countless viewings. Even in the dim light spilling from the kitchen, she could make out the image of a young woman holding a small child. The man's thumb traced the edge of the picture with infinite tenderness before he held it toward Margaret, as if this glimpse into his humanity might serve as credentials for the mercy he sought. "My family," he whispered, the words barely audible above the soft whisper of wind through the bare branches overhead. "They are gone. All gone." Margaret found herself looking into the face of grief so profound that it transcended language and nationality. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of women in the village who had received telegrams from the War Office. She had seen it in Lady Catherine's face when letters from Lord Ashworth grew increasingly infrequent. It was the look of someone who had watched their entire world crumble and found themselves standing alone in the ruins. Without conscious thought, Margaret stepped aside and gestured toward the kitchen. The young man hesitated for a moment, as if he could not quite believe this small miracle was actually happening. Then, moving like someone afraid that any sudden motion might shatter the spell, he stepped across the threshold into the warmth and safety of the manor. As she closed the door behind him, Margaret felt the weight of what she had just done settle upon her shoulders like a mantle she was not certain she was strong enough to bear. She had just invited the enemy into her sanctuary. She had just committed an act that could be construed as treason. But as she watched the young man sag against the kitchen wall, his legs finally giving way beneath him, she knew with absolute certainty that she could not have done otherwise. He slumped to the floor with a soft exhale that spoke of exhaustion so complete it bordered on collapse. The photograph remained clutched in his hand, and Margaret could see now that his fingers were blue with cold, the nails blackened with frostbite. His breathing was shallow and labored, and she realized with growing alarm that he was in far worse condition than she had initially understood. Without hesitation, Margaret moved to the stove where the evening soup still simmered in a large pot. Mrs. Morrison always made extra, a habit born of years, when unexpected guests might arrive without warning. Margaret ladled the steaming broth into a bowl, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what was happening around her. The young man watched her movements with eyes that held equal measures of gratitude and disbelief. When she knelt beside him and offered the bowl, his hand shook so violently that she had to help guide it to his lips. The first sip seemed to awaken something in him that had been dormant, and he drank with the desperate hunger of someone who had not tasted hot food in days. As warmth began to return to his features, Margaret found herself studying his face more carefully. There was something familiar about his expression, though she could not place what it might be. Perhaps it was simply the universal look of someone far from home, lost and seeking shelter from storms both literal and metaphorical. When he had finished the soup, the young man attempted to rise, but Margaret gestured for him to remain seated. She disappeared into the pantry and returned with a thick blanket that she had been mending earlier that evening. As she wrapped it around his shoulders, she noticed that his uniform bore no insignia of rank or unit. The places where such markings would typically be displayed had been carefully removed, leaving only faded outlines in the fabric. This observation sparked a realization that made Margaret's heart race. This was no ordinary prisoner of war who had somehow escaped from a detention camp. This was someone who had deliberately shed the markers of his military identity, someone who had chosen to walk away from everything that had once defined him. She was harboring not just an enemy soldier, but a deserter. The implications of this discovery should have terrified her. Deserters were often desperate men capable of violence when cornered. But as Margaret looked into the young man's eyes, she saw only exhaustion and a profound sadness that spoke of losses too great to comprehend. Whatever had driven him to abandon his post and flee into the English countryside, it had not been cowardice. It had been something far more complex and infinitely more human. Gradually, as the warmth of the kitchen began to thaw both his body and his spirit, the young man began to speak. His English was careful and precise, marked by an accent that Margaret realized was quite educated. He told her his name was Klaus, though he offered no surname. He spoke of walking for days through forests and across fields, following roads only when absolutely necessary, sleeping in abandoned barns and eating whatever he could forage or steal. He had been making his way toward the coast, he explained, though he seemed uncertain about what he hoped to find there. Perhaps a fishing boat whose captain might be willing to look the other way in exchange for what little money he carried. Perhaps simply a place where he could disappear into the anonymity of a seaside town where one more refugee might pass unnoticed. But as Klaus spoke, Margaret began to understand that his journey was motivated by something far more complex than a simple desire to escape the war. He spoke of things he had been ordered to do, of places he had been sent, of sights that had burned themselves into his memory and refused to fade. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and found himself unable to continue participating in horrors that violated everything he had once believed about honor and duty. The night deepened around them as Klaus told his story in halting phrases punctuated by long silences. Margaret listened without judgment, offering occasional words of comfort when his voice broke or when the memories seemed too painful to bear. She found herself seeing the war through eyes that had witnessed it from the other side, understanding for the first time that suffering and loss were not exclusive to any single nation or cause. As dawn approached, the practical realities of the situation began to assert themselves. Klaus could not remain in the kitchen indefinitely. Lady Catherine would be expecting her morning tea within hours, and the cook would arrive shortly after to begin preparations for breakfast. If Margaret was going to help this lost soul, she would need to find him a place where he could remain hidden while she decided what to do next. The solution came to her as she remembered the old servants' quarters in the East Wing, the rooms that had been abandoned when the staff was reduced to save money during the war. The area was dusty and cold, but it was also forgotten, a place where someone could hide for days or even weeks without discovery. It would mean bringing Klaus food and water without arousing suspicion, but Margaret had been managing the household stores for months and knew she could make small quantities disappear without anyone noticing. As she led Klaus through the darkened corridors toward his temporary sanctuary, Margaret felt the full weight of the choice she had made settling upon her. She was no longer simply a maid going about her daily duties. She had become something else entirely, something that had no name in the orderly world she had always known. She had become someone willing to risk everything for the sake of another human being's survival. The room she chose for Klaus was small but serviceable, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the woods from which he had emerged. As she helped him settle beneath the dusty coverlets, Margaret made a promise that surprised her with its certainty. She would keep him safe, she told him, for as long as he needed sanctuary. She would find a way to help him reach whatever destination called to him beyond these walls. Klaus looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and wonder, as if he could not quite believe that such kindness existed in a world that had shown him so much cruelty. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying more weight than any lengthy speech might have conveyed. "You are saving my life." But as Margaret made her way back through the quiet corridors to begin her morning routine, she wondered if perhaps it was Klaus who was saving something in her. Something that had been dying slowly under the weight of war and loss and the grinding monotony of survival. Something that had to do with the belief that compassion could still exist in a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The sun was beginning to rise as Margaret lit the fires and set the water to boil for Lady Catherine's morning tea. To any observer, she appeared to be the same dutiful servant who had performed these tasks countless times before. But Margaret knew that everything had changed in the space of a few hours. She was no longer merely surviving the war. She was actively defying it, one small act of mercy at a time. At a time. The first few days of Klaus's hidden presence at the manor passed in a delicate dance of deception that Margaret found both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Each morning, she would rise before dawn as always. But now her routine carried an additional purpose that made her heart race with nervous energy. While Lady Catherine slept and the cook had not yet arrived, Margaret would slip through the corridors like a ghost, carrying small portions of food and water to the forgotten room in the east wing. Klaus had grown stronger during those first days, though the haunted look in his eyes remained unchanged. He would be waiting for her each morning, sitting by the window where he could watch the woods beyond, as if expecting at any moment to see soldiers emerging from the tree line to drag him back to whatever nightmare he had fled. When Margaret appeared with her offerings of bread and tea, his face would transform with relief and gratitude that made her chest tighten with emotions she could not quite name. Their conversations during these brief visits revealed layers to Klaus that challenged every assumption Margaret had harbored about enemy soldiers. He spoke of his childhood in a small Bavarian village where his father had been a schoolteacher and his mother had tended a garden filled with roses. He had studied literature at university, dreaming of becoming a writer himself someday. His favorite book was a collection of English poetry that he had carried with him throughout his service, the pages now worn soft from countless readings. It was during one of these morning visits that Klaus showed Margaret something that would forever change how she viewed the war itself. From a pocket sewn inside his coat, he withdrew a small leather journal filled with his careful handwriting. The pages contained not military secrets or strategic information, but poems. Dozens of them written in both German and English, capturing moments of beauty he had witnessed even amid the horror of battle. A sunrise over a ruined church, the way snow fell on a field where wildflowers had once bloomed. The face of a child who had smiled at him, despite everything. Margaret found herself drawn into Klaus's words in a way that surprised her. She had always enjoyed reading, but the books available to someone in her position were limited to whatever volumes the family library contained. Klaus's poetry opened windows to experiences and emotions she had never encountered in literature before. His words painted pictures of a world where human connection could transcend the artificial boundaries that war had drawn across maps and hearts. As the days turned into a week, Margaret developed a system for managing Klaus's presence without arousing suspicion. She would claim that mice had gotten into the stores, explaining away the missing food. She would volunteer to clean areas of the house that others avoided, ensuring she could move freely through the east wing without questions. When Lady Catherine mentioned strange sounds from the upper floors, Margaret suggested it was likely the old pipes settling in the cold weather. The deception became easier as Margaret realized how little attention the remaining household staff paid to her movements. To them, she was simply reliable Margaret, going about her duties with the same quiet efficiency she had always displayed. They had no reason to suspect that beneath her calm exterior, she was harboring secrets that could destroy not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in the manor. Yet it was precisely this trust that made Margaret's situation so precarious. Lady Catherine had begun to rely on her more heavily as the war dragged on, and reliable help became increasingly difficult to find. Margaret was no longer just a maid, but a confidant who helped manage correspondence with Lord Ashworth, who made decisions about household expenditures, who provided comfort when the weight of maintaining the estate alone became too much to bear. This growing responsibility meant that Margaret's time was increasingly monitored, even if not deliberately. Lady Catherine would notice if she disappeared for long periods or if her attention seemed divided during conversations. Margaret found herself walking a tightrope between her duties to the household and her commitment to protecting Klaus, knowing that a single misstep could bring everything crashing down. The tension reached a critical point when Constable Pemberton arrived at the manor one gray morning in late December. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing Lady Catherine's breakfast when she heard the authoritative knock at the front door. Through the window, she could see the constable's bicycle leaning against the stone steps, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. She composed herself with effort and went to answer the door, finding Pemberton stamping snow from his boots and blowing on his hands to warm them. He was a kind man in his 60s who had known Margaret since she was a child, and his smile was genuinely warm as he greeted her. But there was something in his eyes that suggested this was not a social call. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, removing his cap and stepping into the entrance hall. "Terrible weather we are having. I hope you are all keeping warm up here. Is Lady Catherine available? I'm afraid I have some rather serious matters to discuss with her." Margaret's mind raced as she led Pemberton to the morning room where Lady Catherine took her breakfast. What serious matters could possibly require the constable's attention at this early hour? Had someone reported suspicious activity around the manor? Had Klaus been spotted by a villager during one of his careful walks to the window? Had Margaret herself been observed carrying extra food through the corridors? Lady Catherine received Pemberton with the gracious efficiency of someone accustomed to managing unexpected visitors. But Margaret could see the worry lines deepen around her eyes as the constable explained his purpose. There had been reports, he said, of suspicious activity in the area. Several villagers had mentioned seeing lights in the woods at night, and Mrs. Henderson was certain that someone had been stealing from her pantry. Most concerning of all, young Tommy Fletcher claimed to have seen a man in strange clothing near the old hunting lodge. The authorities were taking these reports seriously, Pemberton continued, because there had been confirmed sightings of a deserter in the neighboring county. A German soldier who had escaped from a transport convoy and was believed to be making his way toward the coast. The man was considered dangerous, though not necessarily violent. He was desperate, which made him unpredictable. Margaret felt her knees weaken as Pemberton described the search procedures that would be implemented. Every house and outbuilding in the area would be thoroughly examined. Residents were advised to check their properties carefully and report anything unusual immediately. The search would begin that very afternoon and would continue until the fugitive was apprehended. As Lady Catherine assured Pemberton that the manor would cooperate fully with the investigation, Margaret found herself struggling to maintain her composure. Her hands trembled as she poured tea, and she had to grip the porcelain pot tightly to prevent it from rattling against the cups. When Pemberton mentioned that the search teams would include soldiers from the local barracks who were trained in locating hidden individuals, Margaret felt the room begin to spin around her. After Pemberton departed, Lady Catherine turned to Margaret with an expression that mixed concern with determination. "We must ensure that everything in the house is in perfect order," she said. "I will not have these investigators finding any reason to question our loyalty or our management of the estate. You will need to check every room, every storage area, every possible hiding place to ensure there is nothing that could be misconstrued." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she attempted to speak. She understood the terrible irony of Lady Catherine's instructions. She was being ordered to search for the very person she was protecting, to participate in the hunt for the man whose safety had become more important to her than her own life. As Lady Catherine continued outlining her expectations for the day, Margaret's mind raced through possible solutions. Klaus would need to be moved immediately, but where could he possibly go? The woods were being actively searched, and the hunting lodge that had been his original destination was clearly known to the authorities. Every building in the area would be examined with military precision. The only possibility that occurred to Margaret was so audacious that it made her stomach clench with terror. But as she considered the alternatives, she realized it might also be the only option that had any chance of success. If the searchers were looking for someone hiding in the shadows, perhaps the safest place would be in plain sight. That afternoon, as the search teams assembled in the village and began their systematic examination of the surrounding properties, Margaret implemented a plan that would either save Klaus or destroy them both. She had spent the morning coaching him in the role he would need to play, helping him transform his appearance, and rehearsing the story that would need to be absolutely convincing if it was to succeed. When the soldiers arrived at the manor, they found Lady Catherine waiting in the entrance hall with her customary dignity intact. Beside her stood a figure they had not expected to see. A young man in ill-fitting clothes that clearly belonged to someone else, his head partially bandaged, his manner confused and hesitant. "This is Thomas," Lady Catherine explained to the search team leader with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "He is my nephew from London. He arrived yesterday, having been discharged from hospital after suffering injuries during a bombing raid. As you can see, he is still recovering from his ordeal." The officer examined Klaus with professional interest, noting the way he swayed slightly on his feet and the vacant look in his eyes that suggested someone still struggling with the effects of trauma. Klaus played his role perfectly, responding to questions with the slow confusion of someone whose mind had been damaged by violence and shock. When asked about his journey to the manor, he spoke haltingly of fragments of memory, of waking up in hospital with no clear recollection of how he had gotten there. Margaret watched this performance with her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. Every detail had to be perfect. Klaus's accent had been explained as the result of his injuries affecting his speech. His lack of proper identification was attributed to the chaos of the bombing that had destroyed his lodgings along with all his possessions. His general appearance of exhaustion and malnutrition fit perfectly with the story of someone who had spent weeks recovering from severe trauma. The search of the manor proceeded with methodical thoroughness, but the presence of Lady Catherine's injured nephew had provided exactly the distraction Margaret had hoped for. The soldiers were courteous but efficient, checking every room and storage area, while taking care not to disturb the household more than necessary. When they reached the east wing, Margaret guided them through the abandoned servants' quarters with steady composure, pointing out the dust and disuse that clearly indicated no one had been in these rooms for months. As the afternoon wore on and the search teams moved through the manor and outbuildings, Margaret found herself marveling at the strange turns her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a simple housemaid whose greatest challenge was managing the household budget during wartime rationing. Now she was orchestrating an elaborate deception that involved not just her own survival, but the survival of someone who had become far more important to her than she had ever imagined possible. When the searchers finally departed, declaring the manor clear of any suspicious activity, Margaret felt her legs give way beneath her. She sank into a chair in the kitchen and allowed herself to tremble with the release of tension that had been building all day. Klaus, still maintaining his role as the injured nephew, remained in the morning room with Lady Catherine, answering her gentle questions about his supposed ordeal with the same halting confusion he had displayed for the soldiers, but Margaret knew that this victory was only temporary. The search teams would continue their work in the surrounding area, and Klaus could not maintain his masquerade as Thomas indefinitely. Questions would arise about his medical records, his family connections, his plans for the future. Eventually, someone would notice inconsistencies in his story, or Lady Catherine herself might become suspicious of details that did not quite align. As evening fell and the immediate danger passed, Margaret realized that protecting Klaus would require not just courage and creativity, but resources and connections she did not possess. She needed help, but asking for it would mean revealing her secret to someone else, expanding the circle of people whose lives could be destroyed if the deception was discovered. The weight of these considerations pressed down upon Margaret as she went through her evening routine, banking the fires and securing the house for the night. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return, and every step forward now led deeper into a labyrinth of choices that grew more complex and dangerous with each passing hour. But as she paused outside the morning room where Klaus sat reading one of Lady Catherine's books, his injured nephew performance finally abandoned, in the privacy of the late evening, Margaret felt something she had not experienced since the war began. She felt alive in a way that transcended mere survival, connected to something larger than her own small existence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers, but tonight she had succeeded in protecting someone who had trusted her with their life. Tonight, in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything good and decent, she had chosen compassion over fear, humanity over hatred. And that choice, Margaret realized, had transformed her into someone she barely recognized, someone capable of risks she had never imagined taking, someone willing to fight for principles she had never been forced to examine before. The quiet housemaid who had answered that desperate knock at the kitchen door was gone forever, replaced by someone whose story was only just beginning to unfold. Just beginning to unfold. The morning after the search brought a deceptive calm to Ashworth Manor that Margaret found more unsettling than the previous day's chaos. Klaus had slept fitfully in one of the guest rooms, his transformation from hidden refugee to supposed family member complete in the eyes of the household staff. But Margaret knew that maintaining this illusion would require constant vigilance and increasingly elaborate explanations for behaviors that might seem strange to those around them. Lady Catherine had accepted the story of her injured nephew with the grace of someone accustomed to managing family crises during wartime. She fussed over Klaus at breakfast, commenting on how thin he had become and insisting that country air would help restore his health. Margaret watched this performance with growing anxiety, knowing that every kindness Lady Catherine showed only deepened the web of deception they were weaving. The challenge now was not simply hiding Klaus's presence, but integrating him into the daily life of the manor in a way that would withstand closer scrutiny. Lady Catherine had already mentioned writing to relatives in London to inform them of Thomas's arrival. She spoke of consulting the local doctor about his injuries and perhaps arranging for him to spend Christmas with the family. Each of these well-intentioned gestures created new complications that would need to be carefully managed. Klaus himself seemed to understand the precarious nature of their situation. During their brief private conversations, he spoke of his gratitude with an intensity that made Margaret uncomfortable. He had begun to see her as his savior, a role that felt both overwhelming and strangely intoxicating. When he looked at her with those grateful eyes, Margaret felt herself becoming someone she had never been before. Someone important, someone whose choices mattered in ways that extended far beyond the routine maintenance of household order. But the weight of maintaining Klaus's false identity began to take its toll on Margaret's ability to perform her regular duties. She found herself distracted during conversations with Lady Catherine, her mind constantly calculating the risks and complications of their deception. She made small mistakes in her work, forgetting to light fires in certain rooms or preparing meals that did not meet the usual standards. These lapses, while minor, were noticed by Lady Catherine, who had come to depend on Margaret's reliability. The situation became more complex when Mrs. Morrison, the cook, began expressing curiosity about the mysterious nephew who had appeared so suddenly. She questioned Margaret about his dietary restrictions, his preferences, his general health. Each inquiry required careful consideration, as any inconsistency in the details could unravel the entire fabrication. Margaret found herself creating an elaborate fictional history for Thomas, complete with childhood illnesses, favorite foods, and personal habits that Klaus would need to remember and maintain. More troubling was the growing intimacy between Margaret and Klaus that developed as they worked together to maintain his disguise. Their morning conversations, once brief exchanges of food and reassurance, had evolved into longer discussions about literature, philosophy, and their respective experiences of the war. Klaus possessed an educated perspective on art and culture that opened new worlds of thought for Margaret. He spoke of museums he had visited in Berlin, of concerts he had attended, of books that had shaped his understanding of human nature. These conversations awakened something in Margaret that she had not known existed. She had always been intelligent, but her education had been limited by her social position and economic circumstances. Klaus treated her as an intellectual equal, seeking her opinions on complex subjects and listening to her responses with genuine interest. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt seen and valued for her mind rather than simply her ability to perform domestic tasks efficiently. The emotional connection that developed between them was both thrilling and terrifying. Margaret found herself looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that went far beyond concern for Klaus's safety. She began paying attention to her appearance in ways she never had before, taking extra care with her hair and choosing her words more carefully when they spoke. Klaus, for his part, seemed equally affected by their growing closeness. His eyes would light up when she entered the room, and he had begun composing poems that were clearly inspired by their conversations. This emotional entanglement created new dangers that Margaret was only beginning to recognize. If their relationship was discovered, it would not simply be seen as harboring an enemy soldier. It would be viewed as fraternizing with the enemy in the most personal and intimate way possible. The consequences would extend far beyond her own fate to encompass Lady Catherine, who could be accused of allowing such behavior under her roof, and potentially the entire household staff. The reality of these stakes became clear when Reverend Thompson arrived at the manor for his weekly visit with Lady Catherine. The elderly clergyman had been a fixture in the community for decades, and his opinions carried significant weight with both the local authorities and the social circles that determined reputations in rural England. Margaret watched nervously as he was introduced to Klaus, studying the Reverend's reaction for any sign of suspicion or disapproval. Klaus played his role admirably, displaying the appropriate deference to religious authority while maintaining the confused demeanor of someone still recovering from traumatic injuries. But Margaret noticed subtle details that made her stomach clench with worry. The way Klaus held his hands when speaking suggested military training that would be unusual for a civilian. His posture, despite his efforts to appear weakened, retained traces of the rigid bearing that marked professional soldiers. Most concerning of all, his knowledge of London geography seemed oddly incomplete for someone who supposedly lived there. Reverend Thompson, for his part, seemed genuinely concerned about the young man's welfare. He offered prayers for Klaus's continued recovery and suggested that regular attendance at Sunday services might provide spiritual comfort during his convalescence. Margaret realized with growing horror that Klaus would now be expected to appear in public on a weekly basis, exposing him to the scrutiny of the entire village congregation. The prospect of Klaus attending church services opened new complications that Margaret had not anticipated. Every villager would have the opportunity to observe him closely, to ask questions about his background, to notice inconsistencies in his story. Mrs. Henderson from the post office was particularly notorious for her ability to extract personal information from unwilling subjects. Young Tommy Fletcher, who had originally reported seeing a suspicious figure near the hunting lodge, would have the chance to study Klaus's face and potentially recognize him as the person he had glimpsed in the woods. But refusing the Reverend's suggestion would itself raise questions about Klaus's character and Lady Catherine's commitment to proper Christian behavior. Margaret found herself trapped between equally dangerous alternatives, each carrying risks that could expose their deception and destroy everyone involved. That evening, as Margaret helped Klaus prepare for what would likely be his first public appearance as Thomas, she felt the full weight of the choices they had made settling upon her shoulders. They were no longer simply hiding a refugee until he could safely move on. They were creating a false identity that would need to be maintained indefinitely, building a life based on lies that grew more elaborate with each passing day. Klaus seemed to sense her growing anxiety as she coached him on the details of Anglican church services and the social expectations that would govern his behavior during Sunday worship. He took her hands in his, a gesture that sent electricity through her entire body, and spoke with quiet intensity about the debt he owed her. She had given him not just sanctuary, he said, but hope for a future he had thought was lost forever. Margaret found herself looking into Klaus's eyes and seeing something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. What had begun as an act of spontaneous compassion was evolving into something far more complex and dangerous. She was falling in love with a man whose very existence in her world depended on an elaborate fiction that could collapse at any moment. The irony was not lost on her that in trying to save Klaus's life, she might have condemned them both to a future built on deception and constant fear. Every moment of happiness they might find together would be shadowed by the knowledge that discovery could mean not just imprisonment or death, but the destruction of everyone who had shown them kindness. Yet as Klaus squeezed her hands and whispered his gratitude for the miracle of her compassion, Margaret realized that she could not bring herself to regret the choice she had made. Whatever the consequences, whatever the ultimate price they might be forced to pay, she had chosen to see the humanity in someone the world had labeled as enemy. She had chosen love over hatred, mercy over justice, hope over despair. The path ahead remained uncertain and fraught with dangers she was only beginning to understand. But as Margaret prepared for bed that night, she carried with her the knowledge that she had become someone capable of extraordinary courage in defense of extraordinary love. The quiet housemaid who had opened that kitchen door was gone forever, replaced by someone willing to risk everything for the belief that human connection could transcend the artificial boundaries that war had drawn across the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new tests of their resolve. Sunday services would expose Klaus to scrutiny that could unravel everything they had built. Questions would be asked that might prove impossible to answer convincingly. Suspicions might be aroused that would lead to investigations they could not survive. But tonight, in the safety of the manor's ancient walls, Margaret allowed herself to believe that love might prove stronger than the forces arrayed against it. Tonight, she held on to the hope that somewhere beyond the reach of war and hatred, there might be a place where she and Klaus could build a life free from the shadows of deception that currently defined their existence. The fire in her small room crackled softly as Margaret finally drifted toward sleep, her dreams filled with visions of a world where hearts could choose their own allegiances, where compassion could triumph over conflict, where two people who had found each other across the vast divide of war might somehow find a way to build something beautiful from the ashes of everything they had lost. The first Sunday service that Klaus attended as Thomas marked a turning point in their carefully constructed deception. Margaret watched from her usual place in the servants' section as Klaus took his seat beside Lady Catherine in the family pew, his posture appropriately humble, yet dignified. The morning light filtering through the stained glass windows cast colored shadows across his face, and Margaret found herself holding her breath as the congregation settled into the familiar rhythms of worship. Reverend Thompson's sermon that morning focused on the parable of the Good Samaritan, a choice of topic that seemed almost cruelly ironic given Margaret's circumstances. As the elderly clergyman spoke about showing mercy to strangers, about crossing cultural and religious boundaries to offer aid to those in need, Margaret felt each word like a physical weight pressing down upon her chest. The Reverend's voice carried across the ancient stone walls as he emphasized that true Christian charity required seeing the humanity in all people, regardless of their origins or circumstances. Klaus listened to the sermon with what appeared to be genuine interest, occasionally nodding at particularly resonant points in a way that suggested he was following the theological arguments despite his supposed mental confusion. Margaret noticed how his hands rested calmly in his lap, showing none of the nervous tension that would be expected from someone attending their first service in an unfamiliar community. It was a small detail, but one that could potentially attract unwanted attention from observant parishioners. After the service concluded, the real test began. The congregation gathered in the churchyard as was customary, exchanging pleasantries and sharing news from the week. Lady Catherine moved through these social rituals with practiced ease, introducing her nephew to neighbors and family friends with the appropriate mixture of pride and concern for his delicate condition. Margaret positioned herself where she could observe these interactions while appearing to be engaged in conversation with other members of the household staff. Mrs. Henderson from the post office proved to be every bit as inquisitive as Margaret had feared. She approached Klaus with the determination of someone who considered gathering information to be both a civic duty and a personal pleasure. Her questions began innocently enough, inquiring about his journey from London and his impressions of the countryside. But Margaret could see the calculating look in the older woman's eyes as she processed Klaus's responses, searching for inconsistencies or unusual details. Klaus handled these inquiries with admirable skill, speaking slowly and sometimes pausing as if struggling to recall specific details. He described London neighborhoods in general terms that could apply to many areas of the city, and when pressed for specifics about his former employment, he claimed that his injuries had affected his memory of recent events. Mrs. Henderson seemed initially satisfied with these explanations, but Margaret noticed how she continued to study Klaus's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Young Tommy Fletcher presented a different kind of challenge entirely. The boy approached Klaus with the unguarded curiosity of youth, asking direct questions about his injuries and whether he had seen any exciting bombing raids. Klaus responded with appropriate gravity, describing the terror and confusion of air attacks in terms that clearly moved the child. But Margaret saw Tommy's eyes narrow slightly when Klaus mentioned details about London that did not quite match what the boy had heard from other refugees who had passed through the village. The most dangerous moment came when Dr. Hartwell, the local physician, expressed interest in examining Klaus's supposed head injury. The elderly doctor had served the community for over 30 years and possessed the kind of medical knowledge that could easily expose the fabricated nature of Klaus's condition. Margaret felt her blood turn to ice as she watched Lady Catherine warmly accept the doctor's offer to visit the manor later in the week to assess her nephew's progress. As the congregation began to disperse, Margaret found herself walking alongside Sarah Collins, the young maid who worked part-time at the manor. Sarah had always been friendly toward Margaret, but today her conversation carried an undercurrent of curiosity that made Margaret increasingly uncomfortable. She asked about the sudden appearance of Lady Catherine's nephew, wondering aloud why no one had mentioned him before his arrival. Her question seemed innocent enough, but Margaret detected a sharpness in Sarah's voice that suggested she might be harboring suspicions about the official story. The walk back to the manor felt endless, with Klaus maintaining his role as the recovering invalid while Lady Catherine chatted about the sermon and the various parishioners they had encountered. Margaret trailed behind them, her mind racing through the complications that the morning had revealed. Each person Klaus had met represented a potential threat to their deception, someone who might eventually notice details that did not align with his supposed background. Once they reached the safety of the manor, Margaret felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she knew their problems were only beginning. Dr. Hartwell's proposed examination would require preparation that went far beyond anything they had attempted so far. Klaus would need to display symptoms consistent with a head injury severe enough to explain his memory problems and speech difficulties but not so severe as to require immediate medical intervention. That afternoon, while Lady Catherine rested and Klaus remained in his room reading, Margaret found herself pacing the kitchen as she considered their options. The deception that had seemed manageable when it involved only household staff was proving far more complex, now that Klaus was being integrated into the broader community. Each social interaction created new opportunities for exposure, new questions that would need convincing answers. The solution came to Margaret as she remembered a medical textbook she had seen in Lord Ashworth's study, a volume on battlefield injuries that he had acquired during his military service. If she could study the symptoms and progression of various head traumas, she might be able to coach Klaus in displaying behaviors that would satisfy Dr. Hartwell's examination without raising additional suspicions. That evening, after completing her regular duties, Margaret made her way to the study and located the medical text. The descriptions of concussion symptoms and recovery patterns proved both illuminating and disturbing. She learned about the ways head injuries could affect memory, speech, and coordination. But she also discovered how experienced physicians could detect inconsistencies in patient presentations. The challenge would be helping Klaus display the right combination of symptoms while avoiding behaviors that might suggest deliberate deception. As Margaret studied the medical text by lamplight, Klaus appeared in the doorway of the study, having grown concerned by her absence from their usual evening meeting. When he saw what she was reading, his expression grew grave as he understood the implications of the doctor's planned visit. Together, they spent hours reviewing the various symptoms Klaus would need to display, practicing responses to potential questions about his medical history and current condition. The intimacy of these preparation sessions created a new dimension to their relationship that Margaret found both exhilarating and terrifying. Working so closely together, sharing the intense focus required to perfect Klaus's performance, brought them into a collaboration that felt more like partnership than the protective relationship it had begun as. Klaus began seeking Margaret's opinions not just about practical matters, but about more personal subjects that revealed the depth of trust that had developed between them. During one of these late-night sessions, Klaus spoke about his life before the war with an openness that left Margaret feeling privileged to hear such intimate details. He described growing up in a household where literature and music were valued above material possessions, where dinner conversations focused on philosophy and art rather than politics or social status. His father had taught him to see beauty in unexpected places, to find poetry in everyday moments, to believe that human connection could transcend cultural boundaries. Margaret found herself sharing her own dreams and aspirations in return, speaking about books she hoped to read, places she imagined visiting, experiences she longed to have beyond the confines of domestic service. Klaus listened to these confessions with the same intense attention he gave to their practical preparations, treating her hopes and fears as worthy of serious consideration. In his eyes, Margaret began to see herself not as a servant who had happened to show kindness, but as someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered deeply to another human being. The emotional connection between them deepened with each passing day, but so did the awareness of how precarious their situation remained. Klaus had begun speaking about the future in ways that assumed they would somehow remain together, discussing plans and possibilities that could only exist if their deception succeeded indefinitely. Margaret found herself caught between hope and terror, wanting desperately to believe in the future Klaus envisioned, while knowing how easily everything could be destroyed by a single mistake or moment of bad luck. The week leading up to Dr. Hartwell's visit passed in a haze of preparation and anxiety. Klaus practiced displaying various symptoms with increasing sophistication, learning to control his responses in ways that would suggest neurological damage without appearing deliberately performed. Margaret coached him on the specific details of his supposed injury, creating a medical history that would explain his current condition while remaining consistent with the story they had already told. But beneath these practical concerns lay deeper questions that neither Margaret nor Klaus was entirely ready to confront. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the simple dynamic of protector and protected, becoming something that defied easy categorization. Margaret found herself falling in love with a man whose very existence in her world depended on maintaining an elaborate fiction. Klaus had begun speaking of Margaret not just as his savior, but as someone he could not imagine living without. The night before the doctor's visit, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small room, her mind churning through all the ways their carefully constructed deception could unravel. She thought about the consequences not just for herself and Klaus, but for Lady Catherine, who had shown such kindness to her supposed nephew. She considered the impact on the other household staff who could be seen as complicit in harboring an enemy soldier. She worried about the broader implications for the community that had accepted Klaus into their midst, based on lies that grew more elaborate with each passing day. Yet, despite these concerns, Margaret found herself unable to regret the choices that had brought them to this point. Whatever the ultimate cost, whatever the eventual price they might be forced to pay, she had chosen to see the humanity in someone the world had labeled as enemy. She had discovered within herself a capacity for love that transcended the artificial boundaries war had drawn across human hearts. As dawn approached and Margaret finally drifted towards sleep, her dreams were filled with visions of a world where love could triumph over hatred, where two people who had found each other across the vast divide of conflict might somehow build something beautiful from the ashes of everything they had lost. Tomorrow would bring Dr. Hartwell's examination, a test that could expose their deception and destroy everything they had worked to create. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of her room, Margaret allowed herself to hope that their love might prove stronger than the forces arrayed against it. Tonight, she believed that somewhere beyond the reach of war and suspicion, there might be a place where she and Klaus could exist without the constant fear of discovery that currently shadowed their every moment together. The future remained uncertain, filled with dangers that neither of them fully understood. But Margaret had learned that some choices were worth making regardless of their consequences. Some connections were worth protecting no matter what the cost. In choosing to save Klaus, she had discovered parts of herself she never knew existed. In falling in love with him, she had found a reason to believe that hope could survive even in the darkest of times. Tomorrow would test everything they had built together, everything they had dared to dream might be possible. But tonight belonged to them. A moment of peace in a world at war. A glimpse of what life might be like if human hearts were free to choose their own. Allegiances without fear of the consequences such choices might bring. Choices might bring. Dr. Hartwell arrived at the manor precisely at 11 o'clock, his black medical bag clutched firmly in his weathered hands. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as his carriage pulled up the gravel drive, and her heart hammering against her ribs with such force, she feared it might be audible to anyone nearby. The elderly physician moved with the deliberate care of someone whose joints protested every step. But his eyes remained sharp and alert as he approached the front entrance. Margaret had spent the morning in a state of barely controlled panic, checking and rechecking every detail of Klaus's appearance and demeanor. His face bore the pale, drawn look of someone recovering from serious trauma, achieved through careful application of powder and strategic positioning near windows to catch the most unflattering light. She had coached him repeatedly on the specific responses that would satisfy medical inquiry without revealing the deception beneath. Lady Catherine greeted Dr. Hartwell with her customary grace, leading him toward the morning room where Klaus waited in carefully orchestrated position. Margaret found excuses to move through nearby corridors, straining to catch fragments of conversation that might indicate how the examination was proceeding. The voices remained low and professional, punctuated by occasional requests for Klaus to perform simple tasks or respond to specific questions. And so Margaret's choice echoed through the halls of Ashworth Manor, transforming a simple housemaid into someone capable of extraordinary courage. In choosing compassion over duty, love over loyalty to country, she had discovered that humanity transcends the artificial boundaries war creates. Her act of mercy proved that even in the darkest hours, when the world seems consumed by hatred, individual hearts can still choose kindness over cruelty, hope over despair. Sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with armies or proclamations, but with one person opening a door to a stranger in the night.